And we're back. Hello, everyone. Sorry, YouTube dramas. We're back again live. Link in bio. See you there. Hello, everyone. Andrew T and Albert, I can see your chat now. God, I just wish YouTube didn't have so many dramas with their streaming service. Hello, Sammy. Oh, hang on, let me just turn this heaters down. In fact, let's leave this on. Okay. Good evening, Sammy. Right. And I actually managed to see everyone's chat afterwards. G'day, Leo. Once I tried to end the last stream, although I think it's still technically running because YouTube won't let me shut it down properly. So, yeah, somebody asked when will the HCMTs be in service, the high-capacity metro trains? 2021 at the earliest. They're having a lot of issues. They were meant to be in service by the end of last year, but the latest information that I've had is that basically the body / chassis of the trains has been made too stiff. It needs to be less stiff so that it can sort of bend and stuff over Melbourne's terrible quality tracks, because they are worried, the engineers, I should say, are worried that there's a chance that they could derail because they're not flexing to the track enough. Yeah, and so they're sort of seeing at the moment whether they can fix that with the trains that we've got, or if it gets real bad, there's potential they'll be sent back to China where the body shells were made. Wouldn't that be a fun ride for the politicians? It seems that Australia has an addiction to buying crappy trains from overseas that end up not being compliant in one way or another to our conditions, be they good or bad. Yeah, Siemens trains had a braking issue. So, is Baxter getting electrified? Not anytime soon, although we can talk about that a little bit later. So what I was saying before was, yeah, we can run trains with a headway up to 2.5 minutes, which is 24 trains per hour. And we currently are running them every 8 minutes at most, which is 7.5 trains per hour average. So we can really do better. Now, of all the lines in Melbourne, Sandringham line is the best set up to be able to achieve this sort of frequency. And it's the perfect candidate in a lot of ways. to have a true metro train. You know, the Pakenham Cranbourne line might be busier, but the Sandringham line is better set up. Why is it better set up? Well, firstly, it's double track all the way, Flinders Street to Sandringham. It doesn't really share those tracks with anything else unless it's running through the loop, but we're talking direct to Flinders Street. So it's got its own tracks. There's nothing interfering. It's not splitting off halfway like the Pakenham Cranbourne. And so it's really perfect. It's perfect in a lot of ways. Now, some people say, oh, hang on a second. Sandringham has only got one platform, and currently at Flinders Street they only really use platform 13 to terminate Sandringham trains on the weekdays. Won't that be an issue? Well, no. A single platform is what you want at a terminus, actually. You preferably, for any station that's not a terminus, you want 2 platforms. And for any station that's a terminus, you only want 1. Why is that? Well, because in a station that's not a terminus, you're going one way or the other. You're either going to the city or from the city. And whereas at a terminus, there's only one way you're going. If you're at the Sandringham end of the line, then you're going to the city. And if you're at the Flinders Street end of the line, well, you're going towards Sandringham. And so, yeah, and it's fine for people who are disembarking. In fact, it makes things pretty damn easy. Now, the other key to running a 2.5 minute headway on current signals, in current signalling infrastructure, is that you need drop-on drivers. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean a train pulls into Sandringham and the driver gets off on that end, and they don't need to walk to the other end of the train just yet, because another driver is already at the city end of the platform, and they drop on. They drop onto the train, effectively, right? They set the train up to go again, and during this, brief 2-ish minute stop at the station, it's enough time for everyone to get off, everyone to get on, and off you go. The driver then, and you can work in sort of like a 2 train intervals for each driver. So, each driver's got, a bit more than 5 minutes to either walk to the other end of the platform if that's all they need to do, or, if they need to go to the toilet, then they've got time to go to the toilet. Yeah. And it will reduce people running for the train, because if you know that another train is coming in 2.5 minutes, then you're not that worried. There's going to be some people who, they're running quite late and they really need to catch that train. So there's going to be some delays, but yeah. The other thing that really needs to be key to running that sort of frequency is wheelchair accessible platform stops. Why do I say that? Because when it's not wheelchair accessible, then the driver has to get out and put down the ramp so the wheelchair can come on. And that delays the train. It's one of the biggest sources of small delays in metro trains. So preferably raise the whole platform, but at the very least just have those bumps, those level bumps that you see at many stations. I'm pretty sure Sandringham has a bump, but I think Windsor has been fairly recently upgraded to have the full platform at train height. Now, you might ask, why wasn't the platforms built at door height all along? Well, firstly, door height actually changes over time. I think we've got it relatively consistent with all of the trains that are running at the moment. And back in the day, you had, when a lot of these stations were actually constructed, you had swing door trains. And so the door needed to swing out. And if the platform was level with the door, then the door would scrape. So that's why there's things like that where Melbourne's train network is very much still deep-rooted in its history. Andrew T, unless it's like Craigieburn, I'm not exactly sure what you mean for that. Does Sandringham have enough patronage to support it? Yes and no. Probably, I mean, perhaps not all the way out to Sandringham, but I wouldn't really like to terminate any earlier than Sandringham, because then it just messes things up. It's much easier to run all the way out. I think that, say, from Alstonwick-ish to the city, that definitely has the patronage for a 2.5 minute frequency. Beyond that, maybe not so much. But I was talking before earlier about you're competing with the road. Our current transport planning is very much reactive. It's a reactive planning system. And what I mean by that is, like, we do things like, oh, the patronage numbers have to support it already, you know, trains have to already be running at near capacity in order for us to justify increasing the frequency. That's not how it should work. It should be a proactive planning where we say, we're going to put in the 2.5 minute headway because it will encourage people to catch the train. Because if they know that the train is ultra convenient, pretty reliable, they don't need to worry about carrying, I mean, nobody carries, I shouldn't say nobody, very few people carry physical timetables anymore, but you still look up in one way or another what time the train is. And, you know, even though I get 8 minute frequencies, I should say, at my local station, and when I was catching the train to uni every day, I still paid attention to the train time somewhat. It was almost turn up and go, but not quite. And that's why I sort of say that the 5 minute mark is the sort of the switch over, where people stop worrying about what time is the train and they just start worrying about how long is it going to take me to get to the train station, and how long does the train take to get to the city or wherever they're going. Yeah, I'll tell you what, I drive on, when I'm going to uni, I drive on Beach Road fairly frequently, which is the closest main road that runs roughly parallel to the Sandringham line into the city. Yeah, it sort of peels off at one point, but it's a good comparison. It runs close enough, and the traffic can get pretty bad there. Public transport is the real way to solve traffic, because I mean, you see this with roads, and this also sort of justifies my idea of proactive transport planning, is that Eastlink, for example, was touted to be, no, you know what, I've got a better example, the Monash Freeway. How many times has the Monash Freeway been expanded in recent memory? You probably can't remember how many times it's been widened, because it's multiple times. Yeah, a lot, says Andrew. And each time it was meant to solve the traffic woes, but each time it didn't. Why? Because the traffic was a response to the capacity. It was and you wouldn't, it doesn't matter how much you increase the width of the freeway, the demand is always going to outstrip the supply, the capacity of the freeway. So you're much better investing into public transport. There's the same amount of money that, and how many billions are spent each year on just widening existing freeways and stuff. If you just spent that on upgrading existing railways, you'd actually find that the road traffic is much better, because you're shifting people. Luz Dash says more lanes equals more traffic because it encourages people to drive. Absolutely. Andrew says he uses the Monash every day. Yeah, so I'm sure you know the struggles. Thankfully, I don't use the Monash. A busway. Yes, bus lanes are a good idea. Busways, I think they're a bit of a false, they're a bit of a false hope. We'll talk about that a little bit later down the line. So, true metro frequencies in about a half-hourly radius of the city would be really good. Yes, Adelaide has busways. I have travelled on them. Again, I'll get to them. So, yeah. Then, beyond that, to within an hour or so of journey time, I think for Melbourne, you deserve at least a peak frequency of every 10 minutes or so. And the 10-minute services are on lines which, such as Pakenham Cranbourne line, when Pakenham is roughly an hour from the city, but so that wouldn't qualify for an every 5 minute or so frequency, but yeah, it could definitely qualify for an every 10-minute frequency. And so, of course, the 5-minute and the 10-minute trains would intersect, or alternate, I should say. So from Caulfield, for example, I think that's roughly half an hour from the city. You have one train to every 10 minutes that is going to Pakenham or Cranbourne. Dandenong, that's a good point. Dandenong is, I'd say, is a 10-minute. You qualify for the 10 minutes, and maybe you alternate the 10-minute trains so that Pakenham is gaining in every 20-minute service. But even then, I think that's a bit harsh. You could perhaps do it like 7.5 minutes to Dandenong and 15 minutes to Pakenham/Cranbourne. That could definitely work. All right, so Brian just messaged me. Yeah. So that's that. Now, I mentioned earlier suburban rail loop and that sort of thing. It's hard to say what frequency would be good to run on something like that, but at least every 15 to 20 minutes. Anything, if you run a service beyond 20 minutes, then you really do start to push the limits of people's convenience of driving. And yeah, they'll prefer to drive than bother about the train, which comes every 20 minutes sometimes. Now, speaking of trains and stuff, and cars, buses are actually, I should say, they should be one of the most integral things to getting people out of their cars and onto the trains. How does that work? G'day, Applehead. Well, you need to have what are called feeder buses. So every so many stations, there's no set number, just wherever it sort of makes sense to do so, but you'll have a number of hub stations sort of along the way, and various bus routes that converge on the station. They cover the whole area that's around the station that's generally too far for people to really consider walking. If it's beyond a 10-minute walk to the station, people will generally prefer to drive. So that's where you're really covering, focus on covering the beyond 10-minute walking radius of that station, and have logical routes and good frequencies, enough frequency to match the trains. And you'll notice this is a recurring theme, is frequency. Frequency is, in my opinion, far more important than actual train capacity. I'd much rather see us double our frequency than double our train capacity, because frequency is a lot more useful to people. So yeah, the feeder buses will should be the majority of bus routes, and that prevents people from driving to the station, because this is another sort of way where demand will always outstrip supply, and that's in station car parks. How many stations have a car park that's either multiple stories yet still fills up very early on, just as early on as the stations with extremely small car parks? And how many stations have a car park that's so big, that's not multi-story, but it's so big that it's almost worth your while to walk to the next station down the line, because it would be, if you park all the way down there, then it's almost closer to walk to the next station than back to the station where the car park is technically part of. Stony Point needs better frequency? Yes, it does. And as I've said in previous streams, I don't think it necessarily needs to be electrified, but a better frequency, yeah. Yes, single track does somewhat limit frequency, but not as much as you would think, especially when you've got crossing loops at most stations, and the stations are in relatively quick succession. Yeah, there's definitely a, what should I call it, a stigma that buses in Melbourne are slow, rough, noisy, and unreliable. If you speak to the everyday person, not a transport enthusiast, that's what they'll generally tell you about buses. I know quite a number of people who would just never ever consider a bus. So you need to make them logical routes so that it's relatively fast journey. You absolutely need to make sure the buses are clean, because yeah, the trains are very clean now, especially in these current times. But in recent years, since they've adopted a sort of no graffiti policy, then, but yeah, clean public transport attracts a lot of people. Or should I say, doesn't put people off. And yeah, that's the main thing. And buses should interact with trams as well to some extent, but trams are sort of like low capacity trains. Treat them a bit like low capacity trains. That's really how I see them. So any crossing loops were lost quite some years ago, sadly. Need more crossing loops. Yeah, okay. I'm not awfully familiar with the Stony Point line, so I know not every station has a crossing loop, but I thought there was at least a couple. It's certainly not running at capacity, put it that way. Albert says the only bad thing about Melbourne's buses is poor frequency on most routes. Yes, there's definitely poor frequency on a lot of routes. See a lot of routes that are running like every half hour in the peak. That's just terrible. And off-peak frequencies, some are like every hour. That's pretty terrible for an inner city bus service. So buses really they're the most underutilised piece of Melbourne's public transport network. And they really we've done little bits and pieces here and there, but the buses really need a big review to go, okay, much higher frequency, much more logical routes. I mean, I know, for example, that Sandringham Station to Southland Shopping Centre, there's 3 bus routes. They all run on terrible, very odd frequencies that don't really coincide with trains at all. And I think one of them runs on a somewhat logical route. The other 2 go really windy around all the back streets of Blackrock and Beaumaris and stuff. And it's just terrible. $8.58 is a good example of 30-minute peak. Yeah, there you go. Victorian Transport Video says Crib Point had a loop because of Cerberus branch line. Yes. No, Applehead. There's no bus that departs Sandringham Station and goes to Hyatt. I think there's one that departs Hampton Station and goes to Hyatt. But yeah, there's definitely none that, maybe it's Brighton, but yeah, there's none that go direct Sandringham to Hyatt. No, I think that there should be. That's another thing, that buses, there should be a lot of utilisation of buses, is interconnecting routes, where they, yeah, Sandringham to Hyatt makes sense. Those are two fairly close stations on two different lines. I'm sure there are many other examples that you can think of. Yeah, so I sort of talk about busways. I don't think that they are that great. Reason being, the biggest benefit of buses is that they don't need heavy infrastructure built. They can run on existing roads, and yeah, although I definitely think that, as I said, bus lanes are a good idea in some situations, but a busway, you're constructing your own dedicated right-of-way, in which case there's just, you might as well build a train, basically, is what I'm saying. Because the infrastructure, the main capital works to build the right-of-way, that takes up a lot of money. And then the good thing about having it as a train is that you can then upgrade it in time to higher and higher capacities and frequencies. And for that matter, I'm not a big fan of what you might call light rail, what we see on the Port Melbourne and St Kilda lines. I think it was short-sighted to convert them. And I think that the Upfield line, which was slated to be converted into a light rail, but ended up staying as a proper railway line, I think the Upfield line has shown that it's just better to, everything just runs a lot better if you keep it as a train line. And in terms of like doing something like Gold Coast, Adelaide, Sydney have done, where at least for some of the way you construct a brand new right-of-way, sort of like with the buses. I think that once you're building your own a full right-of-way, it's not really worth it to build anything but a train. At least that's my opinion. You think that the Upfield Craigieburn line should reopen? Upfield Somerton link, I assume you're referring to. Yeah, that would be good. Although I wouldn't call it urgent. But it would be nice, put it that way. It would improve both lines heaps. Yes and no. I mean, it is there's been talk for a number of years about reopening it as an alternative V-line route, an alternative route for V-line trains, because the Craigieburn, it would then free up space on the Craigieburn line. And for that matter, I've mentioned it before in the last couple of streams, but I'll mention it again. V-Line should get their own dedicated tracks. They should preferably not interact. They should not be on the same tracks as suburban trains. Concrete can cement container tubes. I'm not sure what you mean, Ahmed. It's a good idea, but it's not the most urgent thing, maybe for the V-Line thing. Yeah, I assume you're referring to not the Upfield Somerton link as not the most urgent. But improving reliability for V-Line and Metro, for that matter, I think that separating those two should be a relatively high priority. And Pakenham and Cranbourne, it was a missed opportunity to build 4 tracks when the level crossings were all removed along that way. But I understand that politically it would have been near suicide for them to build 4 tracks. So V-Line should get their own tracks to Bendigo and Geelong, or all V-Lines should get their own tracks through the city. So I guess we'll talk about trams. What's the purpose of the tram? What does a tram do well? Well, it's not quite a bus, and it's not quite a train. What do I mean exactly by that? Well, I think that it's well known. All the low capacity trams are going to get phased out, and we're moving to sort of 2 to 3 section trams. I think that the E-class trams are 30 metres long. There's been talk of extending them to 40 metres long in an E3 run. I don't know if that will happen. And you've got to ask yourself, at what point is it just not worth it? Potentially, I think, because though it's been talked about specifically for St Kilda and Port Melbourne, Route 96 and 109, it's still possible to convert them back to a train line. And I think that it could be done. But I think that it won't be done anytime soon, at least. But yeah, trams, what are they good at? Light rail, I don't think that they're very good at, because that's just leave it to heavy rail. But trams should most definitely, preferably for all their route, have a separated track. So the infrastructure is not quite as lightweight as a bus. And just for things that I never mentioned, bus lanes. Add bus lanes in where possible, because then they don't get caught up in traffic. Because if you're caught up in traffic, would you rather be on a bus or in your own car? Your own car. What if the situation was you were in a bus but not caught up in the traffic, or you were in the car stuck in traffic? I think you'd rather the bus. Same sort of thing with the trams. You'd rather not be caught in traffic, because traffic is annoying, but what's even more annoying is being stuck in traffic and being stuck in a tram or a bus where you're packed in like sardines. Light rail is better than bus. Yes and no. It's a bit like saying train's better than bus. They're just suited for different purposes. But yeah, they should have, the big benefit of trams is the relatively light infrastructure, so you can have frequent stops. That's the biggest benefit of the tram, is that the trams are relatively small, relatively lightweight, and so that they can stop fairly quickly without too much trouble. And yeah, they can be, again, very high frequency. I mean, what's the frequency of trams down Swanston Street? It's so frequent that you definitely don't need a timetable. Because if you miss the one tram, well, the next tram, you can literally see it. Yes, trams are relatively comfortable as well. Buses, well, trains are ultimately going to be the most comfortable, and then trains and then buses. Although I still think that buses have a long way to be improved. I would like more comfortable seats on the newer trams. Trolley bus, no. Trolley buses, they're not great. All right, see you in transport videos. Because the biggest disadvantage to a tram is that it has to run on its own rails and its own overhead wire. With buses, with trolley buses, yeah, they don't have their own rail, they don't have to have rails, but they've still got to have overhead wire, so they're still restricted in where they can go. So it's just not, they're a bit like the worst of both worlds, in my opinion. So I think trolley buses, as romantic as they are, they're not that great. Yeah, might as well be a bus or a tram. The other real benefit of trams, I mentioned before, Swanston Street. You can go right into the heart of the city, and I think the trams are excellently utilised in the CBD of Melbourne. On Swanston Street, they're excellently utilised. Elsewhere, it depends. Like La Trobe Street, not great. Better frequency needed. But preferably in the city, in the most ideal world, every major street in the CBD should be covered with tram lines. And I actually think that the free tram zone should not be a thing, because free tram zone, it encourages people to catch the tram that would have otherwise walked. And what that does is it fills up the trams, and it just makes it so that the trams get delayed because people are trying to get on the tram when it's clearly full. And yeah, don't get me started on that. You should pay maybe a reduced fare, but you should still pay. The point of fares in public transport, it will make up a little bit of, it will sort of give you help you offset your costs a little bit. But I think that the biggest benefit of fares is that it's a psychological thing where people think, oh, I'm paying for this, so they're going to put somewhat a bit of thought into catching it, and people are less likely to carelessly damage public transport as well, because they think like, oh, hang on a minute, I'm paying for this, so I want to get my money's worth. So it doesn't have to be a lot, but just a little bit. Paying a little bit is good. I don't think that public transport should be free. And so, yeah, in terms of what it's doing is it's reducing, again, in the city, you're trying to reduce the number of cars. And the cities, there's always going to be, demand is going to outstrip supply, but you can at least help it a little bit by having frequent trams along all major roads. Why does Lonsdale Street have no trams? History, basically, because there were never any cable trams there, and it's just, we've been so hesitant. We haven't really built any inner city tram lines in a long, long time. We've extended a few. I guess this is another thing that I want to talk about in regards to trams, is the very long routes. Now I'm quite familiar with Route 86 because that goes to Bundoora RMIT. That's where I go to uni, at least when coronavirus isn't forcing me to stay home. It's a long ride. It takes about an hour to get to Bundoora from the city. And I think that at that point, it would be better, you'd be far better off having better bus connections to the nearby train lines so that I can connect to the train, and really the journey time shouldn't take me more than 40 minutes, but it takes me over an hour. I think it takes me actually more like an hour 15 or something to get to Bundoora from the city. It's nuts. And I'll tell you what it made me do. It made me drive, because although driving was more expensive and I don't like traffic, and although I'm a public transport enthusiast, I'm much more likely to take the tram, but it took half as long. It took me an hour to drive in heavy traffic, or maybe at worst like an hour and a half to drive, but it took me 2 hours by public transport. So I'm saving a lot of time by driving. With inner city public transport, you don't need to worry about beating the transit time of the car. You just need to worry about matching it, roughly, and then making it more convenient. We're selling public transport on the basis of convenience. Will Melbourne get a new tram line in the near future? Probably. I don't know of any that are specifically planned, but probably. We've built a couple in recent times. It says they should have both. The bus connection to the rail lines for people going all the way into the city, and leave the 86 tram is for the shorter point-to-point trips. Yeah, I certainly don't think that, I don't think you should remove the infrastructure, but I think that longer distance tram lines, buses should cover the shorter distance trips. And I think that at some point you should bite the bullet and build a new train line. I think that ideally there should be another train line which branches off at, I don't know, maybe Preston, somewhere like that, and goes to Bundoora, but it's a bit too late for that to happen. And this is what happens a lot of the time, is that Melbourne expands faster than the public transport network does. And so then it becomes uneconomical to build the railway line because you've got to purchase mass amounts of houses. They compulsorily require mass amounts of houses in order to construct a new rail line. And a lot of the time, it just doesn't make sense to do so. So as Melbourne expands, and I think that the west is going to be a key player, because the west is where Melbourne is expanding the most. And I think that you should, at the very least, buy the land and make the reserve for the railway line. It can still be used for farming up until the point where it gets taken over by housing, at which point then the land will become more clearly defined, and closer to that time, that's when you should build a railway line. For that matter, speaking of that, the Deer Park West to Werribee line, otherwise known as Tarn-Eaton Vale Regional Rail Link, or Deer Park West to Manor, but I'll call it Deer Park to Werribee because that's sort of the best definition. I think that was a good idea, and that's really the only inner city, not so much inner city, but the only city, the newest city suburban railway line that is truly a new build and not just an electrification of existing track. I think that is a good idea. Yeah. Buses, again, should interact with trams and provide the best of both worlds in that the best of both worlds, but they should have frequencies to match the trams. And again, we're all basing on the idea that 20 minutes off peak is really the max that you should see. Within an hour, and within half an hour, 10 minutes is the max, or maybe even 15, the max off-peak frequency that I'd like to see. The buses interconnecting tram lines, and there are going to be some instances where buses will form what should I call it, a main route, I guess. They're not just a connecting route. So, yeah. And at some point, is it worth expanding our tram network? In some ways, yes, but in a less city-centric manner. I think that, well, Box Hill, for example, Box Hill has already got a tram that runs out to it. It could be good to build tram lines that feed into Box Hill. Because, yeah, at some point the buses aren't going to be the best solution. Would it be viable to electrify Warragul again because it's housing boom? Well, I spoke about this in the previous live stream, but electrification is sort of it's a false requirement. A lot of people think that in order for it to be a suburban service, it must be electric in Melbourne, and that's just not true. So to answer it more directly, maybe not now, maybe later on. The only real benefit to electrifying it would mean that trains can smoothly run all the way through to Pakenham and stuff. And it's a long way off. I think that just a better V-line service would suit them better for the time being. 5 minutes or so left, so I will briefly mention ferries. Well, ferries, I know of one PGV ferry that goes from Stony Point Station to French Island and Phillip Island. There might be a couple of ferries on various rivers in Melbourne, although I couldn't name them off the top of my head. Yeah, it's for Phillip Island, public transport to Phillip Island, it gets a V-line bus as well. I just think that the ferry does well. If the train, I should say, connected better with the ferry, then, and it was advertised better, then yeah, that would be good. And I think that there's an opportunity there for, if you make space in the train for surfboards and that sort of thing, because obviously a lot of people go to Phillip Island for the surf, and you make room available on the ferry for the same surfboards, then that could very much reduce traffic to Phillip Island, because the bus doesn't really, you're not going to fit surfboards on the bus, basically. Mitchell said some nice words, so goodbye, Mitchell. Definitely ban me. Oh, we have. Perfect. Yeah. Ferry, apart from that, I think that ferries don't serve a huge purpose in Melbourne's public transport system. Definitely they do good work in Sydney, but Melbourne's not a very water-based city, so I think that other modes of transport are just much better. I think the Stony Point ferry, the terminal should be improved as well, because I went there once and it was very rough, and not only that, there was a big drop to get on the ferry from the pier because the tide was relatively low, and oh yeah, it was a struggle for some of the older people to get on. So it's another reason why the ferry service should be improved. I've pretty much said everything that I wanted to say. But yeah, it's all about sort of better frequencies, better connections. Walking along that pier, dodging people fishing, yes, that as well. It's a very eclectic little thing. If you want the most eclectic public transport journey in Melbourne, then definitely go to Phillip Island via the Stony Point line and the ferry. All right. Well, I think I'll end it here. Thanks everyone for watching. Sorry about the YouTube dramas, but yeah. Video on Sunday, hopefully. Live stream in another 2 weeks, and I'll try and start it at 9 p.m, not 9:15, like I accidentally set the timer to this week. But that was my fault. Thanks. See you later.